Can you even believe that we're studying, does it buy time to think? If there's one thing we know in 2025, it is puberty blockers do not buy time to think about your gender identity.
The only inclusion criteria that have so far been made public are that the child must want puberty blockers, the child's parent must agree with them having puberty blockers, and that the gender dysphoria clinics say that the child should have puberty blockers. That's all we have at the moment.
We know that roughly 9,000 children went through the GIDS system. We know that maybe roughly 2,000 children or so were on puberty blockers. We have a control group. All we need to do is follow up. How did those 9,000 children get on?
Not one more child should be medicalized in pursuit of this experiment.
Hello, Mia, and hello, Carrie. We're delighted to have you on because a lot of people are talking about the puberty blockers trial, the puberty blocker study, whatever you're having yourself, that's coming up in the UK. Everybody, talks about Turf Island. They talk about the Cass review. They talk about the ban on puberty blockers. A lot of people think it's all sorted in the UK. They've clarified things and they're going to, roll out these regional centres that are apparently in operation right now, and it's all going to be fine. And yet I work with detransitioners and it's not fine. The stories I'm hearing are, it feels like a very ideological service is continuing, definitely among the adults. Certainly the detransitioners are not getting the care they want. And parents that are talking to me about the under 18s are saying it's still very ideological. So when this pathway study came to be known, basically through your extensive work, Carrie, I've become increasingly horrified and you've become increasingly busy and you have really explored it. So could you give us a good analysis tell us about the puberty blockers trial study that is due to happen in the UK this year?
Yeah, so we've really known that this was coming for quite a long time because it was one of the recommendations of the Cass review that, research take place on puberty blockers. But I certainly... reading the Cass review, it recommended lots of research. It recommended a data linkage study that would connect up the records from children's services with adult services to try and find out what's happened to young people who've already taken these treatments. It recommended in trials of psychotherapeutic interventions so that we could look at non-medical approaches to treating gender-related distress. And it really never occurred to me that we were going to press fast forward on the puberty blocker study before we'd done any of those things. And I think I was really kind of behind the curve, I suppose, a bit. But then last year in October, we were at the Academy of Ideas with a Genspect stand, and I got to talk to lots of members of the public about gender and what they were thinking about. And a lot of people asked me about the puberty blocker study, and I thought I should probably look into this. And when I did, it looked like GIDS Mark II. We were just going to do this all over again. This research that we've already done that we know has such dangerous effects. And I think that's when I called you, Stella, when my blood pressure was kind of going through the roof, and said, they're just going to recreate the mistakes of the past all over again.
I was having a dreadful day. It's one of those you look at the college with your daughter who knows everything days. And we were killing each other. And then you rang me in the middle of it. And I could hear you were panicked. You were going, Stella, this study, it's awful. And you were giving me all these details. And I was kind of blinking, thinking, surely this couldn't be. Surely the GIDS, the Cass review, England, surely they are not going to allow mistakes like that to happen. And you were kind of all over it. And I feel like you were the only person who was actually seriously studying the criteria at that stage, because whenever we spoke to other people, people were very bland in their responses to it. Now, you're the director of Genspect UK and you were taking it, you were kind of newly director, so you were taking it on and you really explored it and you found, I think, pretty horrifying details.
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing that stood out to me was that politicians and health authorities were making a big deal about the fact that it would be uncapped. And we started to hear that perhaps, most gender distressed teenagers would be part of this trial, that several thousand people might be going to participate. And of course, that's just GIDS. That's just people arrive and they're set on a medical pathway and the assessment's not really all of that great, and they go straight through. So I started looking for inclusion and exclusion criteria, the kind of things that we would expect to see based on the evidence base that we already have. Things like people with autism and mental health difficulties who we know are at a higher risk of regret and detransition, whether they were going to be excluded, how they were going to control for things like having therapy at the same time so that we weren't going to confound endocrine interventions with psychological ones. And it just didn't look as though any of these things were really being considered. And some people have said, oh, well, we're going to get a study protocol and it will have all of these kind of this minute detail. But I think the belief that some kind of study protocol is going to be presented, which will do away with these kind of concerns, is just for the birds, really. You just can't do it.
Well, Mia, you could probably tell us about that. Why can't we do a serious study on this issue, puberty blockers?
For me, it starts, first of all, the study itself. If you are looking into whether puberty blockers are safe and beneficial for this group, you are starting from the assumption that they must be safe and beneficial for some of these kids, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't do it. So you're starting from the place that some of these kids are they trans? Are they... First of all, we don't know what we're treating. So there's no clear diagnosis. There's no clear condition. There's no clear evidence of what even a beneficial outcome would look like. So first of all, I would say it can never meet the criteria of real science, because you need all of those things in place in order to measure the outcomes. But then the thing
Can I
about...
jump in with an analogy? So it would be kind of like if you were I am studying how to treat a broken leg, you would have a very clear, what is the outcome? What is the desired outcome? What are we looking for here?
Yeah.
And if it was mental illness, we would be saying, well, what is the actual desired outcome? We're trying to treat, OCD in children. What is the desired outcome? Well, reduced or no OCD in children would be the desired outcome. But there's such prevarication around that, because there's a kind of a vibe that some of these children might be this thing called trans, rather than saying these are children with a mental illness called gender dysphoria. Now, we could unpick that forever, and I know we've another podcast to do about that, Mia. But on the basis of, under the banner of mental illness, the desired outcome is that it reduces, it vanishes, that there are no kind of trans kids who are kind of separated, spotted by God himself or herself to say this is the trans children. So the actual, I'm sorry to jump in, but I really wanted to hammer the point in. The desired outcome is fuzzy, because half the clinicians will say, well, some of these kids might be trans. So they have a different desired outcome in their brains.
The rationale, sorry, Mia, the rationale for treatment was, the other thing that I was really looking for when I started looking into the details of the trial. And it seems to be that patients want it. And that some people who have gender dysphoria want to look more like the opposite sex. And that maybe it buys time to think.
And we know that one.
Time to think. Yeah, we all know that. And we all know that it's not the case, because people, 98% go on to cross-sex hormones, and the other two rationales are so subjective, that it's amazing that we're even considering that they're testable.
Can you even believe that we're studying, does it buy time to think? Can you even believe, I think I'm getting a bit ahead of, we'll get to this in more detail later, but if there's one thing we know in 2025, it is puberty blockers do not buy time to think about your gender identity. Absolutely, we know that. Every single piece of research that has been done so far has shown that. I just want to say what the main thing that I had an issue with when I first read this Pathways study. It opens, and I have it right here before me, it opens with like the NHS is aiming to find out how best to support children and young people with gender incongruence. And then it defines gender incongruence as when a person feels their gender identity differs from the sex that they were given at birth. Some people with gender incongruence want their bodies to be more like their gender identity. How could that ever be a scientific study? We're starting from a completely false premise that first of all gender identities exist, and then there's such a thing as gender incongruence if your gender identity doesn't match your body. What they should be doing is asking themselves, what they're basically saying is, we're taking a bunch of kids caught up in a social contagion who've adopted a fashionable political belief that they are transgender, and we're going to see what's the best medical care for them. That's what they're actually doing, but they're dressing it up in this activist language, so it could never be scientific.
It feels very much they've used that language of gender incongruence. It feels very much like medicalizing gender nonconformity. I think there's one part of the funding application that you're quoting from there that says it's for the management of gender incongruence, as though being gender nonconforming is something that you need to manage and pathologize.
But gender incongruence is itself very much activist language. It's a diagnosis shaped by transactivism that has no meaning whatsoever. It's activism. So we're getting off on the wrong foot. This could never produce any meaningful results because it's being guided by activism, which is precisely what Cass was supposed to remedy. Cass saw that there was ideology-based medicine and that we needed to move away from that. And then the result of Cass has somehow been an ideology-based clinical trial. It makes no sense to me.
Yeah, it really doesn't make sense. It's as though the puberty blocker aspect of the research she recommended is both the most ideological and the most dangerous, the most potentially unsafe, and yet it is the thing that has been brought forward most quickly, and with the most sense of urgency. And it feels like that is part of a political compromise that's been made, because puberty blockers have been banned in the UK, ostensibly. And of course we were all thrilled when the ban came in, understandably. But I don't think we quite realised that behind the scenes, the trial was actually going to enable business to carry on pretty much as usual, which is what it looks like.
If I'm right in what you've told me, Carrie, this study, so they banned the puberty blockers in the UK, and then a few months later, they bring about a study that's due to begin soon, and would have uncapped numbers. And you said there was it could be up to 6,000 children could be technically.
Yeah, I wish we had some more information about that.
Okay. They don't have any exclusion criteria for things like autism, eating disorders, or, ADHD. There's no kind of differential diagnosis that would make those children excluded from this study.
Is it that they don't have those criteria, or we just don't know yet?
We don't know yet.
Okay.
So, what it boils down to is, that there will be a final study protocol which will be published after it's got ethical approval. And basically, once it's got ethical approval, it starts. So there's not really a window to object to that. But the only inclusion criteria that have so far been made public are that the child must want puberty blockers, the child's parent must agree with them having puberty blockers, and that the gender dysphoria clinics say that the child should have puberty blockers. That's all we have at the moment. And given all of the red flags that there are about this and how controversial it is, it feels as though a really detailed information should already be in the public domain about how carefully they are making sure that this is safe and weeding out, people with mental health issues. And my concern is that effectively all the children that present to GIDS if they want blockers, will get them. And I think we have to question what kind of assessment you can possibly do for this, as you say, Mia, this incredibly subjective, activist-led, diagnosis.
And my concern is what you just raised. It's kind of, you called it post-cath complacency, Carrie. And it's this idea that it won't get through ethical review because there's too many people watching it. And I would have, a couple of issues with that. One is I've seen some crazy things get through ethical review. So we can't rely on the academics in ivory towers to have common sense because they've never shown it before. And I also think that there's an issue with people. This has happened a lot in the gender world where there's a couple of people who are well placed. I saw it in GIDS, when I was first, in this world in 2018, and everybody was saying, GIDS is in disarray. And there was a lot of good, decent clinicians in GIDS at the time. So you kind of thought there's enough decent people who know what's going on, who will be able to bring about some sense into the situation. But they didn't have the power. They were rolled over. They were rolled over like tanks. And this has happened in a few different contexts. I saw it happen with the WHO there last year as well, where, there was some well-placed people who were going to really bring sense into the situation. And I was like, I don't believe it. I don't believe it because I've seen activists and their ability to powerhouse in crazy stuff is well documented at this stage. So we can't rely on good faith of, there's a few decent heads in the oversight board, or there's a few decent heads in the ethical review board and they'll put a stop to it. We can't rely on that. There's no evidence to suggest that has worked for us as a plan previously.
Yeah, and I think, since Genspect started, campaigning on this, a few people have reached out to us and said, maybe you should slow down. We don't have all of the information yet. Wait and see. And I really think that's a mistake, just to wait for people behind the scenes, to people, as you say, like the ethical review boards that have passed so many unethical pieces of research, to decide to do the right thing. I think we've got to be really vocal in saying, there's no justification for this.
So, Carrie, could you walk us through the Pathways study? Give us like a really detailed explanation of what this is.
Yeah, so the most recent information we have is from a funding application. The NHS has got over £10 million worth of funding to do this Pathways study. It's going to be broken into 4 strands, and they've all got neat little names, one of which is a trial into puberty blockers. The other 3 strands are Horizon, which I think is kind of a fairly lame attempt to create a control group. All the kids that are seen by NHS gender identity clinics will be invited to be part of this Horizon trial. And they are hoping, I think, that some of them will not want to take puberty blockers and thereby act as kind of a control group for the people who are in the trial section. The Connect strand pathway will look at cognitive development for the kids who are taking puberty blockers. And the Voices section is kind of a patient consultation where they will ask gender distressed patients and their families what they want to see from services and what kind of treatment they want. And there's going to be a lot of patient involvement in consultation outcomes and interpreting the results of the study.
And there's the fifth one, I suppose, is this Pathways engagement. Have you, I copy pasted, so then my notes are in front of me, but it says there's an advisory group of young people and adults with experience with gender incongruence. Honestly, the language drives me mad. I wondered, are detransitioners involved in that? Are they talking to detransitioners who had experience with this disease, this condition?
Not as far as we can tell. So because Genspect runs Beyond Trans, which is the only specialist support service for detransitioners in the UK, we kind of thought they might have asked us if they wanted to consult with some detransitioners. But they don't seem to have done, which is a real shame. I think this links to the data linkage study because, of course, the data linkage study has some hope of tracking detransition rates from the experiment the NHS has already run with prescribing puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. But no, detransitioners do not seem to have been considered in the creation of this trial, which will almost certainly create more detransitioners.
Right.
And if they have contacted detransitioners, the people who are in the Beyond Trans service, they're not all. Some of them are ambivalent. Some of them are very unhappy that they transitioned and they regret it. It's the biggest devastating event of their life. And some of them are kind of, where would I go? They're more complicated feelings around transition. But I know I've met plenty of people who have detransitioned and say that they're happy. They're still in the LGBTQ world. They often take a couple of years to come out of it, and then they say that we're in a trans delusion and it was devastating. But it can take some years. So it's very interesting. They might have spoken to some detransitioners who say, I'm delighted I transitioned. It was part of my journey. Now, I would be devastated if they did do that because that is very disingenuous and it utterly dismisses the thousands of reports, and we have thousands of reports now of people who say this was the most harrowing, devastating experience of my life, bar none. And I'm really crippled by it. So we don't know because again and again, for some reason in this extraordinary hot button topic that has already had a medical scandal been and gone through GIDS, extraordinarily, they took the decision to be very, they don't show the information. They're not showing their work. They're not exposing the public who are extremely interested in this. They're not giving the information around it. So like you said, Carrie, earlier, there's a very lame attempt at a control group. So we can talk about that in a second. But we know that roughly 9,000 children went through the GIDS system. We know that maybe roughly 2,000 children or so were on puberty blockers. We have a control group. All we need to do is follow up. How did those 9,000 children get on? How many of them transitioned? How many of them remained transitioned? How many of them were happy with their medical transition? How many of those with puberty blockers, how did they get on compared to those who didn't get puberty blockers? We have the ingredients for this trial. We have the ingredients for a phenomenal trial, massive level of information. And all we have to do is ask the adult clinics, mandate the adult clinics to provide the information that is sorely needed. But the NHS, because the adult clinics have refused to give the information, rather than make it compulsory and mandate the information because it's unethical to refuse this information, the NHS's response is, let's do another study. We'll know in a few years. It's bizarre as a response.
It was my understanding, though, that in post-CAS, I'm sure I read that they were being forced to hand over the information, and yet now all of a sudden they're not being forced to hand over the information. Do we know what's going on there?
We're trying to find out. Hannah Barnes published an article last week saying that she had heard, kind of behind the scenes, that there's just been no progress on it. They haven't even asked the adult clinics for the data again yet, which is just unforgivable. And I think detransitioners feel so betrayed by the fact that they're going to push ahead with a new trial before they've even got a specialist service in place in the NHS to take care of detransitioners, and before we've done the data linkage study, and actually found out what's happened to this batch of test subjects.
Like on that, there's two points that I think are really important. Is the adult clinics refuse to turn over the information, the data on those 9,000. Now, any of us who've been in this debate long enough know that they bury unfavorable results and they make a really big deal. It's headline news all over the world when there's even a glimmer of positive outcome in any of the studies, and they overblow the positive outcome. So I think it's safe to say they didn't hand over the 9,000 because they know that the outcome is negative, or the outcome will show a larger than 1% regret rate for sure. It will show detransition. It will show all the things that they've been trying to deny and hide. And also the astonishing thing is 9,000 kids and 25 years, and they didn't follow up with a single one. They did no follow-up on a single one of the patients, and it was a live human experiment. They were the guinea pigs, and they didn't bother to follow up with a single one.
And that's one thing, but they're going to do it again. They're just sleepwalking into doing it again, you know.
And to add to your point that they carried out a medical experiment on children, and we know it didn't go well because they closed down GIDS because it was a medical disaster. This was a very badly run clinic, and this was an activist-led and an activist kind of shaped service. And so when it got exposed, they closed it down with the idea of they were going to start something new, and it was going to multidisciplinary, and CAS came in, and it was all going to be, something sensible. And for them to come out within, maybe 6-8 months after CAS, they come out with an ideological study. They disregard the 9,000 and they disregard them. My bet is that they've been told, we haven't followed up. We cannot find that on information. It's gone. It's gone into the mists of time. That's what I'd imagine they're being told.
Oh,
and it's easy. Yeah, it's easy to say that, but I don't have inside information. But on the point, I don't have information. It's incredibly irritating to hear so much behind the scenes insider information that's going on. There's been a medical scandal on children. The day for inside information is way over. Now we need utterly transparency. We don't need any inside information. I'm not even interested in it now. I don't want anybody tapping the side of the nose saying they know somebody who knows somebody who says it's going to be sensible. This should be utterly transparent after the destroying that they've done, the destruction they've done to all these families and their children.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Yeah, I think we need to really unambiguously say not one more child should be medicalized in pursuit of this experiment, and to the people who say, that the ethics board will take care of it, or that, there are some assessment criteria that might make it safe. I think we have to push back and say no child requires medically to have their puberty blocked, their natural puberty blocked.
Oh, stopping puberty. And we're going to discuss stopping puberty at some stage. We've got a really good guest lined up to talk about the impact of stopping puberty. It's devastating. But Carrie, is there anything else you want to say about this forthcoming study that we believe should be stopped and might be stopped? And if it gets stopped, we will be thrilled because we think our efforts and other people's efforts will have kind of combined to stop it. But is there anything else you want to say before we go into the fact that there have been other puberty blockers trials, and we can give you analysis of this, and we will in this episode, so that people know what are the other trials that have already happened? Because even if we didn't do the data linkage study, even if we can't find the 9,000 children that grew up to be adults having gone through the Tavistock, we do have other trials to look to, so we do have some other information. But before we go there, Carrie, is there anything else you want to say about this one?
Yeah, there's just one thing that I want to highlight, and it's the real emphasis that's being placed on this consultation with children and their parents about what the study should look at, how the results are going to be interpreted. All of these things have been co-produced with gender-distressed children and their parents. And I think that's likely to really skew the priorities. We'll talk about the early intervention study in a few minutes, but one of the outcomes of that was that although the children didn't get better, their mental health didn't improve, and sort of declining functioning with a lot of people, they all said that the treatment was fantastic, and that they'd had a really positive experience. And the EIS team, rather than presenting their results in a straightforward way and saying these kids didn't get better, instead said they all really loved the treatment, as though that were, a positive outcome. So I fear that, if this trial goes ahead and the results are really closely shaped by gender distressed kids themselves who are in this culture, which is hugely informed by, ideology and activism, then the results are going to be very similar. if we don't use objective outcome measures, they're all going to say that it was a fantastic treatment.
Right. I'd like to add to that. So my understanding of this is the Pathways trial will be the kids who somehow end up on puberty blockers. We have no idea what the inclusion criteria will be yet. And then there will be the Horizon study, the non-medicalized side. So the kids that do not meet the criteria. Any clinical trial is set up in that you're supposed to have at least two branches of patients. You select one group to go down one path, you select another group to go down another path, and then you measure the outcome at the end. But this particular situation, this cohort of patients, clinical trials are not designed for this unique situation in that all of the patients who are seeking this treatment, who are participating in the trial, are part of some sort of pseudo-religious cult. They have been indoctrinated to believe that they are transgender and that this medical pathway is life-saving care, and anyone who denies them access to it hates them and wishes them harm, and it's because of transphobia or whatever. So the ones who end up in the non-medicalized arm, I'm not convinced that that's going to be, it's not a neutral setting. They may have very negative results because of the cultural situation in which they are living, in which they are constantly being told by trans activists, by everyone around them, that they're being denied access to life-saving care, right? It's not a neutral situation like you would see in a typical clinical trial.
Yeah, and I think you really can't look at the results of sort of just therapy or just a psychotherapeutic intervention when the medical pathway is still on the horizon.
Being dangled, dangling the carrot.
Yeah, it's still there. It impacts all of the other groups. And, when we think about assessments, if medical transition is still on the table, what is it going to be other than an assessment for whether you should medically transition?
Right.
It completely changes the purpose of assessment and therapy to have this kind of predetermined outcome that's always looming on the horizon.
And the problem as well that I have with it is that they, in this proposal that they've put out there, they're saying, we just don't know if blocking puberty is safe and helpful. And I think, there are, maybe we don't know that. I think probably we do by now, but they're saying we don't. But there are things that we do know. Okay, like there are things that we do know. We do know that if you block the puberty, you block the natural cure for gender dysphoria. We know that because 98 to 100% progress onto cross-sex hormones. We do know that adolescence is a time of identity development where you're constantly trying on your different hats and different identities and figuring out who you are. And therefore, we know that we shouldn't medicalize an adolescent identity. We should let that natural process run its course. There are just things that we know about child and adolescent development that mean we should know blocking puberty is wrong. So they're just starting from the wrong place. They need to start from an understanding that these are just adolescents and they need to be allowed to go through puberty.
Yeah, during the webinar that we did about the puberty blocker trial with Sue Evans, I actually asked her, this question about adolescent development, it being a very dynamic and changeable time, and said, how would you, allow for that in an assessment? And she basically said, you can't.
Right.
You can't. Yeah. And we don't let teenagers get tattoos and get married and all of these things because we know that they're in a period of change.
But I think it's better. Tattoos, your parent can apparently consent to you getting a tattoo if they so choose, but you don't show me one doctor who will perform a vasectomy on a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old or a tubal ligation on anyone under 30 even, We don't do that because we absolutely know that the normal trajectory of life is that you don't want kids, you don't want kids, you don't want kids, and then all of a sudden you hit 30 and you need to have a baby right away, and it's the only thing you can think about. We know this, and so this study is not, it has no understanding of what it means to be an adolescent and young adult, and that's the main problem with it for me.
As well as that, I'm not as against the diagnosis as you are, Mia, and we must one day trash it out. I think it'll be a very interesting episode. But I think we lost a lot when we, moved the diagnosis from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria, because arguably these are people who've got some sort of identity issue, almost like, a Scientologist or somebody. They have an identity. There was a mental illness associated with the lack of identity, and they jumped into another identity thinking it's the solution. And it's psychologically interesting to do that. But because it's not called that, and because there's a kind of an underlying, some of these kids might be trans, there's no comparison. I know they've made the point earlier, but it needs to be really leaned into until we open that up and explore that particular issue. We are dancing on the head of a pin. We're kind of splitting hairs because some people think some of these kids might be trans and some of these kids aren't. Yeah. We have to figure out who they are. That's extraordinary to me. That's just extraordinary as a concept.
Yeah. And I think even people, sorry, Mia. Now, I think even people who are, ostensibly kind of oppose gender medicine, I think sometimes passively in the back of their minds, they have this image of, well, maybe there's some kids who this is the right thing for. And, and I think the urge to minutely kind of search for evidence on that it gets really exhausting.
I got the impression that Hilary Cass is one of those that I think she thinks there are some kids for whom this is an appropriate treatment. And so that's where I could never, the Cass report was very, very important for sure, but it didn't hit the right note for me because you can just sense that she does feel that this is an appropriate treatment for some. And I think it's not appropriate for anyone, but I also find it's a bit of a cop-out. I think to me, I feel like the conclusion, we need more research, they're just saying that because it's much easier than saying we've made a catastrophic mistake and we've done terrible harm. So they're just saying we need more research and continuing to do the harm.
Oh, I really think that's why the NHS is so uncomfortable with detransitioners. And I think that's one of the reasons why they don't seem to have been a part of this process, because if they deal with detransition, they have to admit what has happened in the past and that it has not worked out.
I agree with you. I think that there's a fundamental kind of people are stepping around the issue. You know what I mean? Like Hannah Barnes' book, Time to Think, was brilliant. Absolute exposure. It brought down GIDS, and I'm really glad it did. But it never actually went into the point of, well, hang on a second. Who are these kids? What is this diagnosis? I think there's still a book to be written about that. You know what I mean? To go in depth into that point. And I think it's very, very
that should
important.
be me. I should write that book.
Good for you.
You should.
Yeah.
We'll read it. We'll all read it.
Everybody would read it, But could we go into the trials that have already taken place? Because one of the reasons why we are obsessed with this subject is that we have experienced in real time a medical scandal of experiments on children. And these children have been irretrievably damaged in various ways. And I could do a whole thing on regret. Do we ever regret things? A lot of people never regret things, even the most damaging thing in their life. They don't regret it. So asking somebody, are they happy with whether they've medically transitioned is kind of immaterial to me, because I would think, is it a good intervention? Because that's the question to ask. Not are you happy that that intervention was done on you?
Yeah.
That, completely different.
I always say some people were happy with their lobotomies. Does that mean we should still be doing lobotomies? Of course not.
Yeah, and I've known, clients who've had ECT and, they say, oh, well, I might as well have tried that. I tried everything else. People have, anyway, big, long subject. And I'm not saying yes or no to any of those things. I'm just, we don't just do self-report because it's not reliable. Could one of you, maybe Mia, could you go kind of lead us through what the past trials, just a kind of whistle-stop tour of some of the past trials that jump out, that have shown that we already have trials, we have enough trials, there's a line in therapy, you can build evidence forever. Sometimes you have to stop building evidence and act with the evidence you have. So we do have enough evidence, and that's I can speak for the three of us, that's our position. We've enough evidence. We don't need any more evidence. We don't need any more trials. So tell us what we have, Mia.
Yeah, honestly, when I look at the history of it, it's been blatantly obvious from the start that it was harmful and wrong. Even to the point, I reread the case study. There's the famous case study published in 1998. They put one kid on puberty blockers. This is patient 0. And she's a gender non-conforming lesbian. Of course, she was a tomboy. The same old story that we've heard thousands and thousands of times now. And they put her on puberty blockers, give her cross-sex hormones, surgeries, whatever. And then they ask her 1 year after, "Are you happy?" And she's like, "Yes, I'm really happy. Everything's great. I feel great." And so they deem it a success. WPATH adds the treatment to its Standards of Care 6, published in 2001, based on one case study, one patient. That's it. And then that's the beginning of the experiment. 2006, you get this study published. And they notice right there and then that everyone has progressed from puberty blockers to cross-sex hormones. So from a desistance rate of 62 to 98% historically, we've gone on to a 100% persistence rate. All of them are continuing. They notice that, but they don't stop the experiment. Even in the case study, the girl that they did it to at first, they even say, maybe there's a problem with putting them on puberty blockers, that it might kind of make it a foregone conclusion that they want to progress. They even considered that possibility, but still it didn't stop the experiment. Then we get to 2011 and 2014, and these are the gold standard studies. The Dutch protocol is what they're now known as. Unbelievably flawed in the most amazing, incredible way. For the puberty blockers study, they only selected those who went on to cross-sex hormones, which means all of the people for whom puberty blockers did not work out, maybe the outcome was bad, maybe they desisted or whatever, maybe they died, who knows, we don't know what happened to them. They're gone, they're not included in the puberty blockers study. They only include the ones who had a positive outcome and progressed to cross-sex hormones. So there's selection bias. And then they did this, they kill one of them, right? So the boy, he was put on puberty blockers, his penis didn't develop. And when you come to the surgical side of it, they use the tissue from the penis, they invert it, and they line the cavity that they call a vagina with the penile tissue. Because they blocked his puberty, he didn't have enough penile tissue. So they had to use a section of his colon. And the more complicated surgery led to him dying of necrotizing fasciitis shortly after they did the surgery. So that he died as a result of the puberty suppression experiment. And yet still, and this is, we've got 55 kids. So this is an almost 2% fatality rate of healthy adolescents who are put on an unnecessary experiment because they believe themselves to be a member of the opposite sex and they have a psychological disorder that nobody can really define or diagnose accurately. So anyway, they've killed 2%. They've got this high selection bias, and then they do the most remarkable thing. And this, I believe, did this come to light in your Wider Lens episode, Stella? I'm not sure. The switching of the scales.
The switcheroo scale.
This I like Julia Mason's explanation the best. So just quickly, what they did, they take the kids and they give them the gender dysphoria scale to assess the level of gender dysphoria. They give them the one that matches their sex at the beginning of the experiment. So a girl will get the female one, and it will have, situations such as, I feel dysphoria every time somebody treats me as a girl. And it's 1 to 5. 5 is strong dysphoria. So she'll say 5 because she thinks she's a boy. And then she goes through the whole experiment. She has her body altered in all these ways. And at the end of the experiment, they switch the scale and they give her the boy the survey. So it will say, I feel dysphoric every time someone treats me as a boy. Of course, she's going to put 1, no dysphoria, because she thinks she's a boy and she's just gone through this whole medical procedure in order to look like a boy. So Julia Mason, who has been speaking on this issue for a very long time, she says, you could just give a kid a lollipop. You could give them the survey that matches their sex. They fill it in. You give them a lollipop. They eat the lollipop. Then you switch the survey, and gender dysphoria is resolved. And so lollipops cure gender dysphoria. That's how appalling the gold standard research is into this treatment protocol. And then the icing on the cake really is that none of the kids who appeared in the mid-2010s, the social contagion kids with adolescent onset gender dysphoria, with all of their psychiatric disorders and life challenges going on, none of them would have even been eligible for this deeply flawed gold standard study anyway, because they would have screened them out because they didn't allow adolescent onset or major psychiatric disorders to participate. So that's where am I up to? Okay, Carrie, why don't you do the early intervention one, because that links in with the Dutch one.
Well, I was just going to jump on that last little bit about the inclusion criteria for the Dutch protocol, because I think people tend to say now, oh, well, perhaps if we had stuck with those very rigorous criteria that the Dutch protocol had, we would be transitioning the right kids. And I just don't think that's true.
Well, I mean, look how insanely flawed the Dutch research was. The only way they got those positive outcomes was by doing the most ridiculous methodologically flawed study that I've ever even heard of. So we have no idea what the outcome would have been for these childhood onset. But again, going back to just the fact that the persistence rate, the flip, right? So historically, even that cohort that they experimented on, historically, the vast majority would have desisted. And as well, we also know that they would have grown up to be homosexual adults, healthy, whole homosexual adults who had not had any surgical or hormonal body modification. So just that alone is enough to say that this experiment was wrong. You are transing away the gay, like that dark joke at the Tavistock where behind the scenes they were all saying soon there'll be no gay people left. In the early days of this experiment, that's what this was. It was conversion therapy. They were converting the bodies of gay and lesbian adolescents. So just that alone makes it wrong, whether or not this crazy study in the Netherlands could be held up as being of scientific value, which it is not in any way whatsoever.
Yeah. I was rereading Time to Think by Hannah Barnes the other day, and there was a quote that I had forgotten about from the founder of GIDS. Is it Dichegli?
Yeah.
The guy who founded GIDS. Saying, I wonder whether we're creating the demand for this service just by having it. I wonder if we're actually creating transgender, identification in young people. And 20 years later, you were. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Do you want me to talk through the
you do the early intervention
study?
Yeah,
because the early intervention study tried to replicate the Dutch protocol, and it ran in the Tavistock in GIDS. And I hadn't realized this, but it actually struggled to get ethical approval because it wasn't a randomized control trial. So when it first went for ethical approval, the research team said, well, no, we're not going to ethically approve that you do this study because you have no control group, so you won't be able to say anything. And Polly Carmichael and the other staff at GIDS managed to argue that there wasn't any way to randomize this kind of research, and were eventually given the go ahead to go on ahead.
And was this around about 2011, 2012, or when was this?
Yeah, so I think it launched in 2011, and it didn't report for an incredibly long time. Was it 2020 when it finally reported with the Bell?
When Michael Biggs forced them to, they would never have released without Michael Biggs on them.
Yeah, absolutely. So they pretty much they replicated what the Dutch had done and started this group on puberty blockers. And in the end, 3/4 of them, either their mental health got worse or there just wasn't any change. They reported very modest improvements in mental health, and I think it was just the girls. Oh no, sorry, I'm wrong. The girls actually had declining, worsening behavioral and emotional problems, but a small number reported that there were these kind of modest improvements in mental health. And it always makes me wonder why we would use this experimental treatment to achieve modest improvements in mental health when you can achieve those with, psychological therapies, or even, not a fan of psychiatric medications, but they cause modest improvements in mental health as well. So it seems wild to block natural puberty in order to do this. But
there's an interesting thing about, isn't the early intervention as well? They started in 2011, they're still recruiting, and then they declare it a success.
That's
just before they've even done it. It's a success. Let's make this widespread practice.
Yeah, and it was before they had even reported results, they had started prescribing puberty blockers outside the terms of the research study anyway. So this is the experiment that the NHS has already done, sort of officially and unregulated.
In time to think that was kind of forensically analysed, and like in Hannah Barron's book, and the clinicians knew the results weren't good. They knew they weren't good from about 2015 onwards. Presumably before that they knew it because they were working with them, but they had the data and they were choosing not to release the data, which I would like to know what was going on in their heads. What are you doing when you're kind of overseeing a treatment practice that hasn't got good results and you're choosing not to release that into the public? And so for some years, and like you say, Michael Biggs, who is a sociologist in Oxford University, had to kind of get freedom of information on them to release this information about this study. This is not appropriate. This is kind of firing offences in my world.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I actually think, we talk about people who should be prosecuted, for the medical scandal. Like, either people who saw the results of the early intervention study and saw that 3/4 of the children, no change or worse, and kept prescribing blockers after that point. I think, prosecute.
And deliberately buried the results. They had to deliberately bury the results. Like, I've said this many times, that people go to prison for, fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, whatever. Like, people serve prison sentences. Like, this is a similar level of fraud, but the actual real world harm is done to children's bodies. Like, people have had their lives permanently altered by the actions of these people. How is that not criminal behavior?
And especially because when the results did come out, the headline was that this was a well-received treatment. And with that 3/4 figure, that's just absolutely amazing. But they took that from the patient self-report that, as we talked about earlier, that, yes, the kids had said it was a very well-received treatment, but the parent reports were quite insightful. The main thing the parents reported was that the physical well-being of their children had radically declined whilst they were taking these drugs, but it really highlights how self-report assessment criteria are really useless, I think, in general, but particularly in this area, because there are such fixed expectations about treatment and a belief, perhaps, I think, for some of the young people that, I have to say this was good for me because otherwise I'll be being transphobic and preventing other people from getting access to this life-saving healthcare,
And
really see
You know,
that.
the buried information. We should speak about Olson-Kennedy, and you know what I mean, and the burying of that information. But I want to reiterate before we do, you know, that those children who were declining, those children who were not getting better, they all went on to medically transition. You know, 98% went on.
98%.
That's just devastating, because it's like if somebody had called it, if somebody had blown the whistle and said, hang on, no, this should all stop, this is all wrong, those kids could have arguably have been saved, but they weren't, because the information was buried. But Mia, could you tell us about more greed studies?
Yeah, this one, it's the same. It's just they just keep repeating the same pattern over and over. So the terrible Dutch studies, then the early intervention study launches in 2011, and then in the US, I'm pretty sure they launched in 2014 or 2015. This is funded by the NIH. It's Joanna Olson-Kennedy, who she's famous for. She was filmed secretly talking about mastectomies for teenage girls who think that they're boys, I think in 2018. And she said something like, you know, kids can, these adolescents, they can make this decision for that they're mature enough. And if they regret having their breasts removed, they can just get some later on. She actually said that. So she's also facing a lawsuit now. She's been named in the first lawsuit. So this is one of the most prominent people in this medical scandal. And so she and a whole group of other researchers who have ethically dubious credentials launched this study into puberty blockers. Same thing, same idea. We're going to take a whole bunch of kids. We're going to see if blocking their puberty improves their mental health. Again, they recruit them between 2015 and 2018, and the follow-up is 2 years. Now, that sounds familiar, right? Because what the NHS has just launched, yet again, is a follow-up of 2 years for a treatment that has lifelong implications. So, but because they were recruiting between 2015 and 2018, and the follow-up was 2 years, we should have had the results no later than 2021. And we still have not seen them. We still don't know what the results are. This made everyone suspicious, but then Joanna Olson-Kennedy came out in 2024 in this remarkable New York Times article and basically said the results have not been what we expected, or they haven't been positive. So we're not releasing them because we don't want them to be weaponized. We don't want the results to be used against, in order to ban this treatment, because they in the US they've got the many legal challenges. Each state that has banned so-called gender affirming care for kids faces a legal challenge to it. And so Olson-Kennedy and her team have kept the results. They're not publishing the results because they know they're not positive, and they don't want that to be used in order to support the bans on this treatment that is clearly not beneficial. They know what they're doing, and yet I think they always can sleep at night because they can always blame it on transphobia. It's yes, we know that this is not beneficial, but we're protecting these children from transphobia. Anyone who opposes us is transphobic, and I think that's what she's doing. And she also said something really interesting in that New York Times article, in that she said the kids are in really good shape when they come in, and they're in really good shape throughout the study. Basically, that means there's been no change, there's been no benefit, there's been no increase in their psychological functioning. But then you think, if they were in really good shape, why did you have to do this invasive treatment? Why did you have to sterilize them? Why did you have to put them on this treatment? Right.
Yeah. Well, why, impair their infertility for life? Why impair their sexual functioning for life? Why weaken their bones, weaken their cognitive, abilities? Why do all that if they were in great shape when they were in the first place, when they arrived?
They're just lying. You know that they're lying. And I find the psychology of it fascinating. This is, like Megan McArdle, the Oedipus trap,
Oh, yeah.
where she talks about like when you've made a mistake, when doctors have made a mistake so terrible that they just can't look upon it. And I think that's what's going on with Olson-Kennedy and her. Or they were in really good shape, and they're still in really good shape. She's just refusing to see what she's done. They're all at this point refusing to see what they've done. But then that brings us back to why we're talking today. That was then. They got locked into this. They made a mistake. This has been a terrible mistake from 1998 when they first published that study until today. But those, the Dutch, nobody really knew how crazy the Dutch studies were, like the early intervention, like there's not really an excuse there. And I think Susie Green, the former CEO of Mermaids, might have something to do with that. But there was a lot of willful blindness, and there was a lot of like, we can't face up to what we've done. But now the NHS is just doing it again in 2025, and that's what makes no sense. We know everything.
As we're talking through like all of the studies one by one, and now we're coming to the ones that mysteriously, the results have just not emerged. And we've got the data linkage study, and there's the Joanna Olson-Kennedy study, and we've also got in the UK the Logic study, which was just supposed to look at outcomes, of people who'd been to gender identity clinics, and no results from any of those. But we're going to medicalize more children for research because we have to, because we've got no choice but to do this in order to plug the evidence base. It makes no sense.
Like you said, Nia, that first study, that kid, the 1998, and she was born female, clearly lesbian, and she had shame over her genitals. She, when she transitioned to a man, didn't have any long-term relationship. This was not by objective outcomes, by objective measures. This wasn't a success. But with self-report, oh yeah, I'm delighted I medically transitioned. Well, you would be, because you've had phalloplasty and there's no reversible intervention for that. So you'd have to be mentally very, very robust to be able to say you regretted that. So it was a farce from the beginning.
I love Az Hakim's explanation of this. He told me that these like, and she is the classic case, but so many of them are. They start off with gender dysphoria, and then they go through the whole medical process, and they have transgender euphoria, but then somewhere down the way they just end up with transgender dysphoria. They're just not happy. But you're right, the self-deception that has to go on, because you're at the end and there's no going back. You can't undo all of those medical procedures. So you face a choice. You can either keep telling yourself, even though you feel shame. She felt shame with her genitals and she couldn't form intimate relationships. That to me is Az Hakim's transgender dysphoria. Nothing was solved. She's just in a different body, but she can't go back. So imagine having to admit what you've done, what you've given up, and it still hasn't made you happy. It's much better to continue to convince yourself that it was the right thing.
And this paper came out I think it was just last week, wasn't it, showing that there are significant increases in mental health problems and suicidality after sex reassignment surgery. And I think people forget that puberty blockers are a gateway drug. They lead to cross-sex hormones, they lead to surgeries, and they lead to much worse mental health outcomes,
So to finish, thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. I wonder, Carrie, could you give us the last word about why you think this, study shouldn't go ahead, and maybe anything that people should do if people are concerned, if they're listening to this, because we really want to unite people in the UK to say, let's put a stop to this study. It's going to harm children and it's going to devastate families.
And for people who want to get informed and get across, all of the details about the study, Genspect has got loads of resources on our website, genspect.org/international/UK. And there's a full report about the practical and ethical problems with the study. We've also just brought out a briefing about puberty blockers and detransition. We actually asked some of our Beyond Trans service users about their experiences of taking puberty blockers. And there's a couple of really detailed Yeah, they are. And there's a couple of really devastating case studies there as well, that people can look at. I think everybody should write to their MP. I think the time to be, sort of passive and wait for more information has gone past. I think everybody should try and let their representatives know that we don't think this should go ahead, and the reasons why it shouldn't.
Thank you, Carrie.